So we finished the Q&A. First of all, I think the thing that I tried to say on our stream prior to the Q&A is when you get a live Q&A, when you have people from the community getting to ask questions, the community team has to select those questions. They're pre-screened. So just know they're probably cutting some really crazy out there questions that they knew they couldn't answer. They're probably picking questions that they're hearing more than once. So if you hear it, if you think a question is silly, they're probably not the only person wondering it. And your question always sounds better in your head than how everybody else hears it. That being said, you never know somebody's background with the amount of this game they've covered. And so sometimes people are asking a question that's been asked before. Sometimes they're getting an answer that's been an answer we've gotten before, but to a different question. And it's still new information to them. Sometimes saying something even slightly different, even if it's the same meaning, but it's a different set of words by the live translator or whoever, we hear a different message. And so it is hard to get this right. So typically just assume that live Q&As, that 2/3 of the questions will have nothing to do with you, that you will think they are dumb questions. They are not new information. It is a giant waste of time. Just assume that. So we got through 8 of the 30 questions. Shocking. My guess was 10 on the high end. It's an hour long. Yoshi P gives incredibly generous and detailed answers, even when the question is something that we may not have thought needed that. He's incredibly generous. So I'm going to blast through I just wrote down a couple of words to remind you. Not exact. I'm sure it's VODed if you want to go get the exact questions, exact answers. This is just kind of my impressions of the concepts that were talked about and the concepts that he's responded with as a set of context around this. The first question was, how do they come up with names of expansions? Keep in mind, we've already had stuff like this before when they explained how ARR was this dawn, the new dawn coming out of 1.0, and then Heaven's Word was this looking up, which is what he wanted to do with his first expansion, into this blue sky as we move into the day. Stormblood was this setting of the night, and then Shadowbringers is the overnight, and we are about to, in 6.1, move into a new dawn once again. But he elaborated by saying that he appreciates having these strong words, to have the team have some theme that they can make sure that all pieces of content are pointing back towards. But when they do that, they pick these strong words and then they have to run them by the different languages and different localizations and make sure that there's something that's going to work. It's not already taken. It's appropriate. It means what they think it means. And so that's really hard. And so when people are, that kind of brings up, well, how frustrating was it that we got SB followed by SB and we had to make it SHB, and now people are like, oh, Endwalker, ew, gross, that means ew, like why would they even do that? That is just the last standing of a bunch of good ideas. And so it's just something there to kind of do that. The second question was, will we see more crossover type villains, villains that call back to previous Final Fantasy games? This question has been asked before. Can you tell me about the villains in this? Effectively, can you reveal what the pace of the content is months in advance, patches in advance? Can you tell me when we're going to have a crossover event? Can you tell me what these... And that's not what the question was intending, but that is a question we've gotten before. And so naturally, the answer is going to have to kind of beat around the bush because he wants to leave things in the future. So they'll say things like, oh, we currently don't have anything, but then they'll announce something. And so he said, that's not... Instead, he went a different direction. He talked a lot about, that's not really how we come at it. We don't pick a boss and then write it into the story. We write the story and then decide what boss is appropriate for that. And it might be a boss from another game. They love doing fan service in this game, so we probably will get more, is the safe answer. It's just a question of not if, but rather when. Remember, this expansion is going to be all original content for our raids and for our alliance raids, but original doesn't mean it can't be a tribute. It doesn't mean it can't be a callback to other things in other Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy games are really easy to kind of nest something in where something has a meaning. Look at the difference between what Viera are in this world, where a male Viera is a bunny. That was gone over when they introduced Viera. They're rare, was what they said, and that's why we didn't have male. That was the lore justification for why they weren't available until now. But in other games, my understanding is that the male Viera have been trees, and so there's some weird stuff going on there. So they can do parallels where they're different, but a callback. They then had a really specific question about the bird in E5S. The Eden series is the memory of our Warrior of Light, and that memory is a bit fuzzy. You have to imagine we've been hit in the head a few too many times. And so when you look at the Eden series, there's a lot of weird stuff going on with the Eden series as far as like the justification, especially within Savage. There's a playfulness in like the way we unlock extremes this expansion in the Sorrows of Werlit, where it's kind of like, this is how I imagine it being told, right? Think about the minstrel unlocking these harder modes. It's the telling of a tale. It's not necessarily meant to be representative or metaphorical. It's you wake up from a dream and you're like, did that mean something? And so he was generous in his answer there, but basically, yeah. The next question was why Black Mage? We may have gotten 9 questions. I don't think I counted these right. Why Black Mage? And actually, Yoshi P said, honestly, it comes from a love of things like Diablo. So he loves playing things like this. He loves that kind of mechanic. He loves blowing things up. He talked about his time as a Black Mage. He talked about his love for games like Diablo. Keep in mind, these devs love other games. They love other games from developers and publishers that you don't like or aren't your thing. Yoshi P has been a huge fan of Diablo and has mentioned it time and time again. He has said he's always wanted to work on a title like Diablo. So for all the people that are like, Yoshi P gets it, he hates Blizzard, it is a lot more like when you see in the news that 2 sports stars from 2 different teams in the same sport, rival teams, go on vacation with each other's families. Because their lifestyle is so different than the average person's that getting to hang with each other, they kind of get it. They're both in it. Now, when they're on the field, they're competitors, but when they're off the field, they're peers. And so keep in mind, when he talks about his inspirations, he oftentimes references other games. It is incredibly important to this team that they care about Final Fantasy, that they play Final Fantasy, that he plays his character legit, and he levels up, and he learns rotations. And he was asked later, do you look up rotations? One of the upcoming questions was, do you look up rotations? He said, yeah, I go use resources a lot of times from overseas about what best in slot is. I have my rotations. I feel comfortable in the 2 or 3 ways that I play my Black Mage, but I usually have to go look up people who've calculated what my best items are for me as I look at how much spell speed I want to get. And so they play this game. But they also play other games. That's something he's mentioned in the past being incredibly important. So when asked why Black Mage, that's one of the reasons that's important to him. He was asked what the hardest thing he's done from 2.0 to now is, and he gave a 2-part answer. The first is he said the hardest thing they've ever had to do was housing, especially when they had to make the decision to make the legacy servers cost more for housing than the newer servers, because legacy servers had a lot of gil at the time. For me, that feels weird because it feels like you were aware that you needed to use housing as a system to deal with resources in the game, and that you were going to make this scarce resource and you're going to use it as a great equalizer for players with a lot of wealth versus players with not. And it's a hard departure from where housing is now, where there's a small house for 2.9 million gil, and that sounds like a lot to a new player, but to the vast majority of the base, that is a number they can have or they know how to get. So I found that kind of a frustrating answer, only in the context of the fact that tonight I crossed my 64th hour in housing Savage. We had 2 houses get bought out from under me, both on stream today, and it's just frustrating to hear that you ate this as one of your hardest moments. It comes to mind immediately, and yet you've let housing devolve to this. And so when they mentioned earlier this weekend that housing is something they're looking at how to change, how to improve, you got to give me more than that, man. You got to give me something here. This is ridiculous. From there, he mentioned what his happiest memory was from 2.0, and he said it was the first FanFest. He intended to go on stage and apologize. Remember, 1.0 was a disaster, guys. Not because of bad intentions, not because of bad ideas, but because execution plus ideas plus intentions, resources, time, all these things, sometimes the end product is just not good. It doesn't matter whether the devs cared. It doesn't matter whether the devs wanted to make something good. It doesn't matter whether the players tried to give it a chance. Sometimes the end result just isn't there. And 1.0 was that disaster. And 2.0 is a turnaround that still to this day, it is the exception, not the rule. There's a reason devs limit the amount of resources that they're willing to put into the relaunch of something that's already failed once. And it's because the vast majority of the time, it won't work out. And he walked out and people applauded. He was stopped by people, he said, as old as 60 or 70 years old, saying, I really love this game. And I think to this day, that's still something that humbles him. And it's one of the things that really stands out in all the constant communication we get with Yoshi P. It's amazing that he continually feels at awe of us, because that's very much a circle. We continually, in turn, feel in awe of him. And so we really owe a lot to this dev team. And It's not for lack of trying. It's not as simple as saying, well, they care about the game, because that implies that other people don't care about the games they make. And that's not true. But the constant communication, the execution, the transparency, there's something about how they care and about how they show us they care. There's something there that's just different than most other games. And we're incredibly lucky to hear from him in 2 live letters for every patch, multiple events like the Rising and FanFest, actual written letters, interviews across like the last media tour. I think he gave 30. There's something silly. He gives probably at least 50 interviews a year. I mean, we're hearing from Yoshi P or his team probably somewhere between 50 and 100 times a year. Seriously. They're in big waves, so it's not once a week, but it's an epic amount. And that's what means when something goes wrong, we don't immediately assume they don't care. We assume we tried a lot of stuff and we're just sorry. And yes, there's people who being told sorry doesn't fix it, right? If somebody accidentally trips you and you fall down, them saying they're sorry doesn't make it not hurt. So people who are sad that Ultimate was delayed, people who are bummed that we're not getting Raw female at the same time that we're getting male Vieira, people who are bummed about various choices, bummed about the way FanFest is shaped up in some way, sorry doesn't necessarily fix that. But it's a whole lot more than when we feel like they're not saying sorry. And that's pretty incredible. From here, he was asked, where does he get his motivation? And has he ever considered writing a book? He said there have been books written about him. They're all in Japanese. I would point you guys to some of the documentaries on the game for people in English that want some of that history, some of the behind the scenes, how we've gotten here. And just watch these interviews, watch these dev blogs, watch these things, because they give you a lot of context. Listening to the way he thinks about something that doesn't matter to you can help you understand when he says something about something that does matter. It's why we listen to these things. It's not necessarily that the second half of a live letter is always super big bombshell moments. It's a continued context, especially for the fact that he thinks and communicates in Japanese, even though he understands and can speak English. And so translation is a huge gap between us and the devs for the majority of this game. A huge number of them communicate only or majority in Japanese. And so even just hearing the same thing said from them multiple times by multiple translators can help us understand what the real meaning is, where we might have misheard something or misunderstood something. And he said his motivation comes down to us appreciating it. We have given him an incredible career and an incredible opportunity, incredible support, and he wants to give that back. And he views it as this circle. He doesn't have time to write a book, but it doesn't mean he never would. And does he look at current fashion? Do they look at current fashion for kind of the glamour and the cosmetics of this game? The cosmetics of this game are big and they're broad, and he said they plan these items. He said 3 patches out. I don't know if that means half patches or full patches. He mentioned 6 months, but by some math that could also be seen as like a year. So like I don't really know what they meant as far as that time schedule, but basically several patches in the future. So it can't be hyper current. But they're aware of it, but it's mostly that the item developers have ideas. They're probably inspired by things they see in other games and in fashion, and then they bring things and they say, hey, here are kind of my proposals. So actually it was mostly him just reminding us that he has a lot of people he trusts. He's built a team here. Okay? I mean, Soken is a name we all now know. There are the Koji Fox, Michael Christopher Koji Fox. There are these names we know. Some people who are super into lore know the different writers of the different stories. This is a team, and so Yoshi P is our figurehead here. But when it came to kind of the fashion, it was actually the answer wasn't really about fashion. The answer, in my opinion, was more focused on I trust the team, and they have to make these decisions. And then it was a reminder of how timelines work and things like that, all within the context and the vocabulary of fashion. But that was the answer that I got from that question. From here, they said, what happens when you, Yoshi P, and the players want something different? And he said, we have a huge number of players with a huge number of wants, and a huge number of devs with a huge number of wants for what they want in this game, and what they feel is best, and what they feel is most important. Oftentimes we see people go, it's not that hard. I could make Blue Mage not a limited job. It'd be super easy, and everybody'd love it. A reminder here, guys, there was an interview question a while back on why Blitzball hasn't been added, and the answer wasn't that they hadn't talked about it. It's that every time they have a meeting about it, there's too many different solutions on how it should be implemented, and they can't settle on one that doesn't leave some portion of that developer room, that group, brainstorming disappointed. And so then they fear, well, gosh, if we're disappointed, how is the fan base going to respond? And so they just don't touch it because they can't do it well. And so Blitzball continually just gets pushed out as something, yeah, that'd be cool. How? And so he said, basically, imagine that there's an A way and a B way of doing things, and the devs want to do way A and the players want way B. It's not so much that we're going to just do what the players want, because then what's going to happen is we're going to do what they want, and then we're going to realize we only have the tools to continue B, and it's going to be this sharp jerk when we have to pan over and go back to way A. It's going to seem like we're not listening. We can't just do way A and ignore the players. And so typically what he said, actually the summary of the question ended up being something along the lines of, they end up implementing way A because that's what they were already on plan to do. They're the devs. This is what they do, right? You can't just give kids ice cream. They're going to go their way. But over time, as way A changes and iterates, they're going to begin bringing in aspects of B. And so it may never reach B, but it's going to stray that way. And I think that really lines up with how we see these systems mature. Why we see Summoner Scholar be the only thing of a system that's been tossed out. Why we see, instead of companions continue to get developed, give way to squadrons, give way to trusts. It actually explains a lot about how we do this. But on that note, I hear the music starting up for the next section, so I am going to take off. This was a chance to talk about the Q&A, and kind of my thoughts on it, and what we're doing here in FanFest, and just talk about gaming, kind of.